Feminism is one of the great liberation movements in human history.
Feminist is someone who believes in personal, professional, and political equality.
The topic of feminism is another example of people co-opting it, taking it out of our hands, and we have to kind of take it back.
Feminism is for men as well as women. It's the only way we're going to make it.
Welcome to a very special Shiftmakers podcast series to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of feminist.com, a nonprofit website I founded in 1995 to foster awareness, education, and activism. I'm your host, Marianne Schnall, a writer and journalist. Over the course of my 3-decade career, I've enjoyed the incredible honor of interviewing a variety of remarkable changemakers, and it is my pleasure to share some of these insights from the past and present with you for this podcast. Welcome to Shiftmakers. In honor of Feminist.com's anniversary, we're dedicating some episodes to exploring the significance of the movement through the years, examining the current landscape of feminism, gender equality, and women's progress. We also look ahead to the future of feminism and how we can co-create a more equal world. When I founded Feminist.com 30 years ago, few people even knew what the internet was. Most people didn't even own computers. Netscape was the only browser, and all web pages were gray. And only 15% of internet users were women. I'm proud to say Feminist.com created the first web presence for a number of important women's organizations like the Ms. Foundation, V-Day, Equality Now, Girls Inc., and many others. Needless to say, I've seen a lot of change over the years, not just in technology and media, but also in the progress, as well as sometimes, unfortunately, the regression of equal rights. So on this anniversary, I wanted to reflect back on some key moments in the history of feminism, as well as how the movement has evolved over time, and share quotes from some of the brilliant feminist voices I've had the honor of interviewing over the years. I, of course, won't be able to cover everything. The feminist movement has a long and complex history, but I wanted to touch on some important moments, issues, and milestones, as well as some common misconceptions, and why feminism is still so relevant today. Let's start with the word feminism itself and the meaning people ascribe to it. Per the dictionary definition, feminism is, quote, the belief in and advocacy of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. And I often ask this simple question to many of the people I interview: what does feminism mean to you? Here's an excerpt from a conversation I had with actress, director, and writer Amy Poehler about feminism when I interviewed her for AOL Build in 2015. There's a lot of talk right now about celebrities coming out as feminists, and also talk about whether that is even a good thing for, feminism to become trendy, or whether that dilutes its meaning.
Oh, I want to talk to you about this.
Oh, good, because I really want to talk to you about this. I want to know how you feel about that, and also, do you consider yourself a feminist, and what that means?
Well, I just to say I'm going to take this moment to plug your website, feminist.com, because I love it,
Oh,
and have loved it for a very long time.
Thank you so much.
I'm interested in this discussion because, to me, I've said before that, sometimes when people talk about don't identify themselves as a feminist, sometimes to me it's like, wow, it's like saying, I like cars, I think they're great, I use a car every day, it gets me from place to place, but I'm not going to go on record and say that I think cars are good.
Right.
But that being said, this discussion, this media discussion about who is and isn't a feminist is yet another example of the media attempting to divide us, to take us and split us apart and argue among each other, right? I think we need to continue as women to constantly celebrate what we have in common and share, and stop letting this society focus on how we're different. It's really frustrating. So yet again, the topic of feminism is another example of people co-opting it, taking it out of our hands, and we have to kind of take it back. And so that's my thoughts on it. You could tell that I was really riled up on that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. And here is world-renowned feminist icon, activist, and organizer Gloria Steinem sharing her thoughts on the word feminist.
It doesn't matter what word we use, as long as it has the same content, it will be treated in the same way. And there are other words. There's womanist, there's mujerista, women's liberationist.
Right.
There are other words that mean the same thing, and they get the same ridicule. We need to choose what word we feel comfortable with. That says women are full human beings, and whatever that word is, will get a lot of opposition.
Right.
This is a revolution, not a public relations movement. I think it's a good word. It has a remarkable amount of support. It's just that it's treated as if it's failed if it's not 100%.
Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter Melissa Etheridge.
It constantly amazes me how they have vilified and demonized the word feminist. I can't believe that it still has that effect. And I'd say feminist is someone who believes in personal, professional, and political equality. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or whatever. Those three things. It's just equality.
Actress and activist Jane Fonda.
When women own their strength and men own their hearts. That to me is what feminism is when our full humanity is claimed. You can talk about equal rights and you can talk about, but essentially, feminism will come into wholeness when we achieve a social paradigm that allows men and women to become full human beings, rather than women muting themselves and men hardening themselves, which I think is the root of all the problems, including war.
And here is Dr. Carol Gilligan, psychologist and author of what has been called one of the most influential feminist books of all time, In a Different Voice, at a 2012 feminist.com salon.
Feminism, to me, is one of the great liberation movements in human history. It's the movement to liberate democracy from patriarchy. It gets rid of the divide between women and men because patriarchy is devastating for women, and it's also devastating for men.
As Gilligan emphasizes, patriarchy is the system that created the need for a feminist movement in the first place. When our country was founded as a patriarchal society 250 years ago, women were not recognized as full citizens or included in the Constitution. The laws were written by men for men. Again, here's Gloria Steinem.
Women weren't citizens for, from 1776 through, the constitutional amendment. I mean, we were possessions like tables and chairs. So there was not the opportunity to own property, to have the right to one's own earnings, to have the right to your own children. You could be forcibly returned to a violent husband. You were property, literally, like a thing. And the laws of slavery were modeled on the laws affecting wives. So that takes care of the long time through the 1920s. And since then, we have been overcoming legal barriers since we couldn't sit on juries. Law schools didn't accept women or accepted a small percentage of women when I was growing up. So, those are just symbolic barriers, but they're illustrative, powerful barriers. So the idea that only women could raise children meant that also when this wave of feminism began in the 70s and we began to try to elect women, there were two most frequent questions of women candidates. One, if you don't have children, why not? You're an unnatural person. And two, if you do have children, why aren't you home with them?
Here's the late former President Jimmy Carter, a passionate advocate for ending the global mistreatment of women and girls, on how religion has historically been used as a justification for sexism and inequality.
One is religion. If a husband is inclined to abuse his wife, or if an employer is inclined to pay his female employees less than a man, at least indirectly or subtly, they derive their conviction that it's not really a bad thing by the fact that a woman is treated as an inferior person in the great religion. So when men in secular life, who might be religious or not, see women being treated as secondary in the eyes of God, they assume that it's okay for them to do it.
It has always been important to me to highlight men's involvement in the feminist movement through my interviews and initiatives. Here is Ted Bunch, Chief Development Officer of A Call to Men, with his thoughts on the damaging effects of patriarchy.
We're all taught. It's our collective socialization. None of us are immune from it. We've all been taught to behave certain ways around this masculinity that here in the U.S., but it's really wherever there's patriarchy, it looks the same. That women and girls have less value than men and boys, that women on some level are the property of men, and that women and girls are seen as sexual objects. Those are things that are taught. Where you find patriarchy, you'll find all of those things.
Ever since our country was founded, women have had to fight against the systemic patriarchy and gender inequality that have been baked into our culture and all areas of society. That's the work feminism has taken on. Every right and freedom that women have gained since the founding of the country has been due in large part to feminist movements. These movements are often categorized roughly into waves as a helpful way to break down the historical eras. The first wave of feminism began with the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, where leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Harriet Cady Eaton created the Declaration of Sentiments and launched an organized women's suffrage movement. After more than 7 decades, many women won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. However, the majority of Black women were still denied that right due to discriminatory laws, even though activists like Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells were a central yet under-recognized part of the fight for the 19th Amendment. But the right for Black women to vote was not fully secured until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Here's Nancy Pelosi, a trailblazer for women's political progress as the first female Speaker of the House of Representatives, from a fireside chat I did with her in 2018 at a Women in Politics event.
When they got the right to vote, people said, the press said, women given the right to vote, not given, worked for, marched, fought, starved, were starved, separated from their families, alienated, and the rest to fight for the empowerment of women. We stand on their shoulders. They really fought the fight. And then over the years, more people fighting the fight until we did get the right to vote, and then women's right to choose and so many other things that are at risk now.
The second wave of feminism started in the 1960s and lasted for about 2 decades, with figures like Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, and Audre Lorde making huge cultural strides that eventually led to major policy change. This era included the passage of the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which aimed to close the gender pay gap. But it's worth noting that the gap is still not closed, with women earning around 80 cents on the dollar compared to men, a gap that's even wider for women of color. In 1973, the landmark Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade established a woman's right to an abortion under federal law, which was considered a huge win for women's reproductive freedom, though that decision was overturned in 2022, giving individual states the ability to regulate access to this health care, leading to full abortion bans in some states and endangering the lives of countless women. Earlier this year, I hosted a panel on this topic where I spoke with author Clara Bingham and author and activist Jessica Valenti, who is one of the leading journalists reporting on the state of abortion rights in the U.S.
Remember that in 1973, when Roe was passed, 1 million women a year were getting illegal abortions in America and risking their lives. Around, we don't know exactly the number, but it was between 1,000 and 5,000 women were dying because of this. And so every single day, we're going back to Jane Crow, and we're going back to our humanity not being respected. We are no longer first-class citizens in banned states.
The way that these laws are being written in the 14th Amendment, the fact that her humanity is being discussed, this is what kills me, as if it's a political talking point. The fact that our personhood is being discussed in courtrooms, that when emergency abortion was in front of the Supreme Court, that there was literally in the oral arguments a moment where they were discussing how many organs would be acceptable for a woman to lose before the state should be required to give her an abortion. I mean, literally, that's where we're at. And so for me, we're already there. It's about our very personhood and humanity.
Activist, author, and law professor Anita Hill.
Really kind of frightening when
Yeah.
you think that there are people who are leaders who are willing, in fact, seeming to look forward to being able to monitor women's reproduction, pregnancies. I think that is well beyond anything that I thought we could ever even contemplate as a country. Privacy issues and medical issues monitored by the state. You know, if you look at that as a marker, then we're in a very, very frightening place.
The late Cecile Richards, former president of Planned Parenthood, shared this about another feminist legend, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the issue of a woman's right to choose.
I'll never forget my very first few months here at Planned Parenthood. I went to the Supreme Court. We had a major case to argue, and sitting there in the audience and seeing, because it's such an intimate, small space, and there, this tiny, fierce woman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was literally holding on her shoulders the entire population of women in this country. And of course, it was a choice issue. So she was trying to represent all of us. And it was so stunning to realize, and of course, it made me realize how other disenfranchised groups have felt all their lives of not being represented in the highest court in the land. And so there's just a lot more we have to do, but a lot of opportunity, and it's up to us to do it.
U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett.
This, first of all, is about a person's right to privacy. And that was how it was interpreted through the Supreme Court for almost 50 years. It's a privacy issue. And if we say that it's okay to violate my privacy, then what will stop the government from violating your privacy? So again, it's not necessarily about whether or not you agree. It's about understanding the larger concept of demeaning and degrading a certain class of people just because the government decides that that's what they want to do. And it could be you next time.
Another significant moment of the second wave was the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, which finally allowed women to get credit cards, bank accounts, and mortgages in their own name instead of their husbands' or fathers', offering them an unprecedented path to financial independence in America. Then the third wave of feminism began in the 90s, largely sparked by Anita Hill's landmark televised testimony in the 1991 Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. Her testimony captivated the nation and ignited a long overdue conversation about sexual harassment. Here's Anita sharing with me how she found the courage to speak out.
When you talk about people who do things that people perceive as really courageous, most of the time what motivates them is not the risk that they're looking at, not the consequences of doing a thing as much as the consequences of not doing it. So for me, when I think about the hearing, what motivated me to do it was bigger than the consequences of doing it. I knew that I had important information about how Clarence Thomas, what kind of judge he was going to be, about his own behavior, really said that he had no respect for the law and that he believed himself to be above the law. And that, knowing that the law was going to be written by and shaped by someone with a disregard for it, was what I was looking at as happening. And that was the consequence that and that I could have an impact on how that shaped took place and what happened. That was really what motivated me more than, I mean, it just outweighed the consequences. Now, I didn't know what all the consequences were. Maybe that helped. But I think that there's some place in your conscience that says, if I don't act, then I will have been a part of something that I don't want to live with. I would have been a part of moving away from something and turning my back on something.
Hill's brave testimony inspired women across the country to come forward about sexual harassment and lay the groundwork for future movements like Me Too. It also spurred an unprecedented number of women to run and be elected to Congress in 1992, which was dubbed the Year of the Woman. Another important aspect of the third wave of feminism was that many leaders and organizers in the movement sought to be more inclusive when it came to race, which the prior movements had been criticized for lacking. The concept of intersectionality, a term coined by scholar and theorist Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989, gained traction as a way to help illustrate that people can face multiple intersecting forms of oppression at once based on their gender, race, class, or other identities. Here's Kimberlé explaining to me how and why she came up with the term.
And I thought there ought to be, right, some way of persuading courts that this makes no sense at all. It can't be that if Black women don't experience sexism the same way that white women do, they haven't experienced sexism. And it can't be that if they don't experience racism the same way that Black men do, they haven't experienced racism. So what do I have to tell you, judges, so that you can see that the intersections of racism and sexism are as much a part of illegitimate discrimination as when they're not intersecting? In other words, what kind of metaphor can I produce for you to see what happens when Black women are being hit with both racism and sexism? So intersectionality was just that metaphor. I looked around and I said, well, look, we all go through intersections every day where traffic is going in many different directions, and you can be hit by traffic simultaneously. So maybe this will help, judges. If you put yourselves in an intersection, you can better see that this is the way that disempowerment can happen when you're subject to more than one kind of ism. That's what intersectionality is. It's the interface of various forms of discrimination or exclusion or subordination, and the fact that our tools aren't usually attuned to the intersection, to their interface. So that's what intersectionality is. It's a prism. It's a way of seeing things that might ordinarily be missed if you just have a singular view of what racism or sexism or other isms happen to be.
We previously talked about the definition of feminism, but the truth is, at least to me, it's really more than a word, it's a value system. Since equality and fairness are core values of feminism, it makes sense that the feminist movement evolved over time to support multiple issues and forms of inequity and injustice, including equality for the LGBTQ+ community, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. Because when one group's rights are infringed upon, it ultimately affects us all. Here's social justice activist and organizer Pamela Shifman, president of Democracy Alliance, sharing her thoughts and riffing off a famous quote from feminist poet Audre Lorde, who once said, quote, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own."
You know, our liberation is intertwined. I just believe that in the deepest way, that none of us are free until all of us are free, right? It's we say that a lot, but it's just true. It is absolutely true. I don't want to live in a world in which other women aren't free. I don't want to live in that world. That is not a good world for any of us.
Writer, organizer, and co-founder of the gender liberation movement, Raquel Willis.
I think it's about continuing to build spaces where we can learn from each other. I think there still needs to be a tremendous amount of political education around the experiences of people marginalized by the patriarchy and by gender. I think that folks have to understand that attacks on trans and non-binary people are attacks on everyone, because none of us kind of fit these perfect scripts and boxes around gender. We all defy norms in some way. And it's all about everyone being less restricted and having the freedom to chart their own paths without discrimination and the threat of violence and othering. No one wants to feel that way.
Another powerful moment in feminist history from this era was the 2017 Women's March on Washington, one of the largest mass protests in U.S. history. At least 500,000 people were in attendance at the D.C. March, and millions more gathered to march in cities across the country and the world a day after Donald Trump's inauguration. I attended the march in D.C., and it was truly inspiring to see such a diverse group of people join together in solidarity to protest unjust policies and fight for a wide range of human rights and social justice issues. Here's activist, Emmy-winning journalist, and host of Black America, Carol Jenkins, on the power of collective action.
This is what the movement for equality is now. It's not a tiny, narrow path. It is a broad stream of people in America who understand that we are all in this together. And if we don't solve this together, we are going to sink. And what's at stake is not only equality, but it's pure survival.
Having worked in the feminist space for over 30 years, I've seen the various ways feminism is often misunderstood. Two of the most common misconceptions are that feminists hate men and that men can't or shouldn't be feminists. But in my experience, neither of those things are true. This is a movement that seeks to benefit us all and can and must include men with us and alongside us. I've interviewed many men who proudly identify as feminists and some who have even made it their life's work to be allies to women in the feminist movement, to invite more men in and spread awareness about the ways in which constrictive gender roles, patriarchy, and inequality hurts not just women, but men, boys, and people of all genders and identities. Again, Ted Bunch.
So I think that's what we have to do, is really challenge the constructs that exist, whether it's around race, gender, class, religion, and really look at the center, which is our humanity, right? Where is the common thread? Where is the humanity? We're so caught on holding on to what we have and once we let it go and see what else is available to us in the world, then it's really like we've really been holding ourselves back. And that's what patriarchy does. That's what racism does for white folks. That's what patriarchy does for men as well as obviously women, but it really harms us all.
Again, Jane Fonda.
It's really important for feminists to understand that patriarchy takes aim at girls' voices, but it takes aim at boys' hearts. And it happens real early with boys, like 5. Just really wrapping ourselves around that will open our hearts with empathy to boys. We have to raise our sons to remain emotionally literate and not allow this bifurcation to take place. Feminism is for men as well as women. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's the only way we're going to make it. If we understand it and speak about it, what can we do for men is help them see that this is not attacking men. On the contrary, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's democracy.
New York Times columnist and political commentator Nicholas Kristof.
I think that, we have to see this as a major issue of human rights and justice, and just kind of making the system work that affects all of us, and that men need to be a part of as well as women.
Governor of California, Gavin Newsom.
Why is it that men can't be recognized for being outstanding advocates for women? You don't need to be gay to be, great advocates for the LGBT community, et cetera. In every aspect of life, you can maintain your empathy and your advocacy, and so I think you're seeing that, and I think it's a great thing. I mean, I think people are realizing it's just, we're not two separate tribes, so we're all in this together, and that men have a responsibility to be advocates for women, women advocates, men and young boys. Men cannot be let off the hook in terms of that advocacy.
There are a few additional defining moments throughout history that stand out in my mind as truly elevating the conversation around feminism and gender equality. One is Hillary Clinton's famous remarks at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
Her words have since gone down in history as one of the most significant rallying cries for gender equality. At the closing of the conference, representatives of 189 governments created the Beijing Platform for Action, a comprehensive global plan to achieve gender equality. Another iconic moment was in 1996 when writer and activist V, formerly Eve Ensler, debuted her groundbreaking play, The Vagina Monologues, which broke taboos, challenged stigma, and created room for new public conversations about women's bodies, sexuality, and gender-based violence. The play inspired V to do more, having heard from so many survivors. One evening, V joined a feminist.com board meeting at my apartment in New York. We were all listening to her share her bold ideas and vision as we sat around my dining room table. Right then and there, V's organization, V-Day, was born, a global activist movement to end violence against all women, gender-expansive people, and the earth, which has now raised over $150 million for grassroots anti-violence groups across the globe. Here's V from a conversation I had with her a couple of years ago about V-Day's 25th anniversary.
Look, we haven't ended patriarchy, and we certainly haven't dismantled it, and we certainly haven't ended all violence against all women and girls. But we certainly have made our mark.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have, when I began this work 25 years ago, there were women before me, the Judith Millers and the Take Back the Night people, and people who have been doing this work. And then before me, there was Rosa Parks, who was doing this work long before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was sitting on a bus. She was fighting for ending violence against Black women who were being raped and who were being attacked constantly. But I do think in 25 years, when I started this, there was no mainstream reporting on violence. It was never a front page issue. People didn't want to hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
I was a pariah everywhere we went. And it is now real and it's mainstream. And there is acknowledgement that this is a central issue of our times. We have broken taboos. We have taken the word vagina out of the closet. We've opened that discourse, right? I think we've looked over these years at all the ways that workers' rights and the environment and every issue that exists on the planet intersects with violence against women. So how do we keep working on those coming togethers?
And then a more recent pop culture moment was when Beyonce, who has been a longtime advocate for women's rights and racial justice, famously performed her song Flawless in front of a giant feminist sign during the 2014 MTV Video Music Awards, a song that features a line from Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie about feminism.
We say to girls, you can have ambition, but not too much. You should aim to be successful, but not too successful, otherwise you will threaten the man. Feminist, a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes.
Beyonce's performance brought the word to a broader mainstream audience and sparked widespread conversation. A couple of years later, Beyoncé once again brought women's equality into the spotlight, and this time it was personal for me. As many of my listeners will know, in a rare interview with Garage Magazine, she recommended that her fans read my book, What Will It Take to Make a Woman President? Conversations about Women Leadership and Power, which of course prompted the book to quickly sell out and require a second printing. That's a moment I will never forget. I'll always be grateful to Beyoncé for using her platform to further the conversation about feminism and the importance of advancing women's leadership. And speaking of having a woman president, while we still haven't reached that milestone in the US, Hillary Clinton's and Kamala Harris's historic candidacies were powerful feminist moments that moved the needle closer, helping all of us imagine a woman as the highest leader in the land. Here are a few words from Kamala Harris herself about that campaign.
On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. That doesn't mean we won't win. The important thing is don't ever give up. Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. You have power. And don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before.
And then, of course, another significant contribution to the feminist movement, which is often considered to be the start of a fourth wave, was the emergence of the internet. This is when feminist.com came on the scene, and over the years, more feminist organizations, leaders, activists, and content creators began to utilize it as a tool to connect, spread awareness, and organize action. 30 years later, in our present moment, we're at a pivotal juncture for feminism, because the internet and social media platforms have not only sharpened the discourse and helped spread awareness, but they have also deepened divides, and biased algorithms have increased misinformation. This is one reason why feminist.com aims to continue to be a trusted hub of information, connection, and action, and why it's important that we all continue to use our collective power to support feminist media platforms, leaders, and organizations as we keep working for a more equitable, just future. With the future in mind, I'll leave you with these inspiring messages from Anita Hill and co-founder of Black Voters Matter, LaTosha Brown.
What we have to understand is that we have to be bold and we have to be brave and we have to think inclusively. And we also have to believe that inclusive change is possible.
We know the story of the founding of America, and we know the story of the founding fathers. The very fact that this nation was created just in terms of thinking of men, right, in itself is part of the weakness. And so I think in this moment, I want women to start thinking beyond being citizens of this nation. I need you to start thinking of yourselves as mothers of the new America. I think you to think as founders of this new America that has enough space to be inclusive, has enough space to be equitable, has enough space that every human being can be treated with some measure of respect. So we've got to be the mothers of that.
Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we'll be sharing new conversations with feminist leaders about the current state of feminism, issues of gender equality and women's progress, and why feminism is still needed today more than ever. For more information about the history of feminism, please visit feminist.com for our History of Feminism timeline. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again.
This episode of Shift Makers was made in partnership with feminist.com. Producer Asha Daya, research assistant Angela Joshi, edited by A. Kirsten and Davi Armanino, and creative direction by Kyle Hollingsworth. For more information about Marianne Schnall, please visit marianneschnall.com.